I see we've got lots of Australians joining us. Very nice. I know it's late there, guys, so I really appreciate you joining us. We really wanted to make this session earlier so that we could accommodate as many people from around the world as possible, because it is a very, very, very big and important topic. Hello to Riva, welcoming her. Nice to see you there. From Germany, visiting us.
We have a few minutes.
We have a few minutes.
Yeah, so we're okay.
Hello, Ron. I see Ron's joined us. Hello, Shirley in Australia. Very, very nice, Australia. Appreciate you guys rocking up, because I know it's really, really late there. So thank you guys. South Africa.
Oh, we don't have Olga yet.
We don't have Olga. Do we try
No.
Olga?
Yeah, I'm going to call her.
I see her. Here's Olga.
Olga!
Here.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Olga.
Quickly positioning my laptop, so I've just switched off my camera. 2 seconds.
Good to see you all. I see many private messages coming in. Good to see you all. Please, if you can, put on your cameras. I want to see your gorgeous faces. Hello. I'm good, and you? You know, my suggestion, because I'm about to start a Zoom panel in literally 2 minutes. It's okay. It's okay. You want to pop her a message via Facebook? try via Facebook message. Lekker. Okay. Bye. Pleasure. You too. Bye. It's how you multitask. Okay, where's our Olga?
Here I am. How are you, Rolene?
So happy to see you, Olga. Queen Olga.
And I'm so happy to hear that you still have an accent.
Well, you haven't seen me or heard me when I lose my temper here. It's very interesting. I go full redhead ginger.
That's good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you
Hello,
for being with
everybody.
us.
Of course. It's an honor.
And there's Dan. Everybody just signing in at the moment. We've got people from around the world. We know you're up super early to accommodate us, and thank you so much, because we've got folks from the States to Australia, all around the world. So it's a really, really great opportunity to educate, but also thank you guys for making the time to chat to us. I know it's a range of time zones that we're trying to accommodate, but this is a very important topic, and it's great that we have this moment just to connect and to catch up. So we'll give it I think a minute or so and then get started.
Hey, Rolene, I'm making you host now, okay?
Okay, let's hope for the best. Just so that you all know, I'm a little bit technology challenged. So
I'm going to try and do this now, and I'm here to help you in whatever you need.
thank you. Hello, Linda. Hello, Sylvia. Hello to my Lay of the Land co-founder who snuck in. Yair Shlush. Hello, Tirza from the JCPA. Welcome. Hello, Austin. Hello, Vivian and Itzik. I see you guys joining us all the way from Modiin. Hello, Gila. Hello, Ingrid from Ranana. Hello to the guys from Bridges for Peace. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really, really great to have you here. All these beautiful and mostly familiar faces. Hello to Donne. Guys, when you join, if you can mute yourself, because we're going to get started in a few minutes so that we can get all the material in as much as possible. Hello to Tamar, joining us from Cape Town.
To put my video in a second.
There you go.
Hello everybody from Cape Town. Lovely joining you.
What's the situation in Cape Town looking like, Tamar? We've heard from Paulette in Australia, lots of lockdown.
Tuesday on lockdown 2, so we can buy cigarettes and alcohol on Tuesday. That is the relief. We still have, yeah, we can drink and smoke. We still have curfew at night, 10 to 4 in the morning. We can travel between the provinces, but international travel is still banned. Listen, the country is not in a good state. We have many deaths, but please God, people will still carry on being responsible, keeping their masks on, having social distances, and please God, we'll get over this. And we're looking forward to fly to Israel via Dubai.
So are we. Listen, I don't know if the Emiratis know what they're in for with the influx of Israelis coming to their shopping malls. But really great news coming in within the last couple of hours that our foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, has spoken to the Emirati foreign minister. Any blocking of phone calls, of websites, that has been lifted. So now we can communicate with each other. We are sending, or one of our pop stars, performers, Omer Adam, he's heading to the Emirates to perform. So, you know, I think great things will happen when Emiratis and Israelis get together to have parties. I just, you know, I worry if there's a Primark somewhere in Dubai, it's going to be full of Israelis, and they might regret this. I mean, who knows? But it's good news, and we're seeing the movement around the region. Bahrain, Oman, perhaps to follow, maybe Morocco, even the president of Lebanon saying he's open to the suggestion of talking to Israel. So who knows, we could see a different Middle East within the next couple of years. But if you haven't muted, I'm going to ask you to mute, and I'm going to hand over to the chairperson of WIZO Modiin English speakers, making her debut in hosting. A great big welcome to Martine Alperstein. And Mart, I'm going to hand it over to you, because let's get started so that we can get those important questions in and people can join us as we go along.
Great. Thank you, Rolene, for the introduction. I'm very excited to have you all join us today for the very first session in our Zoom series. Today's session is being held in partnership with the World WIZO Public Diplomacy and Hasbara. And before I go ahead, I'd just like to remind you all to please make sure that you keep yourselves on mute, just so that it makes it easier for everybody. Okay, I'm very excited to introduce our panel to you today. We have Dan Diker, who's the director of the Political Warfare Project at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan is the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. He's also a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC in Herzliya. Dan is also a noted expert on Israel issues and is the co-founder of the SA South African Israel Policy Forum. We also have Olga Meshoe Washington, who is the Charlotte Regional Director of Club Z Zionist Youth Movement. Olga hails from South Africa, where she had a very successful career as an attorney and a corporate consultant. She moved to the United States to earn her master's degree and has worked in advocacy for Israel, speaking at various venues in the US and in Africa. And Olga has also served as the CEO of DAISY, Defend, Embrace, Invest, Support Israel. Rolene Marks is a freelance journalist, broadcaster, and keynote speaker who appears on international radio, television, and has been published in numerous global publications. Rolene is the owner of Rolene Marks Consulting. She is co-founder of Lay of the Land. She is the host of the Israel Brief, which airs daily on YouTube, and is also co-founder of the South African Israel Policy Forum. Rolene is also the World WIZO Executive for Public Diplomacy and Hasbara. Thank you. Rolene, over to you.
Thank you, Martine, and thank you guys for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, as we were all signing up, we come across various time zones in various countries to discuss something that has become very important and very topical. And that is the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. What does this mean, and what kind of impact does this have on global Jewry? I've been very privileged to speak to audiences in the United States, in Brazil, in South Africa, and in Australia, looking at the issues, trying to understand this, because it comes at a time where we all are concerned with improving the situation and working for social justice, especially where we see issues of police brutality and racial inequality. It's part of the tenets of WIZO that we work for equal rights, that we work for social justice, but in and amongst the slogan of Black Lives Matter is a movement, and that movement is a lot of the time seen as anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and this does impact on our diaspora communities. So I'm going to hand over to somebody who I respect immensely, and I'm so delighted and I'm so honored to have both Dan Diker and Olga Meshoe Washington join us today. These are two people that are not just friends, but they are colleagues who I hold in the absolute highest esteem. And I'm so thrilled to be doing an event with Olga. It's our first time to do something together. It's way overdue, Olga, but I'm going to hand over to you to put things into perspective, to give some historical context when we talk about accusations of apartheid, and why it's not enough just to understand the role of Jews in civil rights in various countries like South Africa, like the United States, like Australia, like the United Kingdom. But it's also important to understand why this charge is important, why we understand it, and how we move forward when we deal with all the issues that Black Lives Matter impacts.
Well, thank you very much, Rolene. Not to show favoritism, but I would be amiss if in my greeting to everybody, and I'm seeing faces that I haven't seen in such a long time, if I may quickly, in the introduction that was given, it mentioned that I moved to the United States to pursue a master's degree. That was the plan. My mother says to me, we sent you to the United States for 2 years to get a master's, but you're still there. And the reason as to why I'm still here is because in the process of studying, I got married and I had a baby. And I married an American, and so here we are. But South Africa is still very much home, very, very much home. So any opportunity that I have to engage with people from South Africa, I'm so excited. And specifically, I need to say hello to Tamar. She was one of the first people who embraced me as I started my speaking, and as we started to work with Daisy, welcomed me to her home. In fact, her home was the first place that I had Rosh Hashanah dinner. I'm in the process of still forgiving her, because she never told me that you can't eat the first night the same way that you would eat a normal meal, because it's going to be the same amount of food, if not more, the second night. So I remember like filling myself to capacity the first night. She's like, oh, second night is here. I was like, what? We're doing this again? So I just want to say it's so good to see you, Tamar. I love you lots, and thank you for everything that you've done. And you too, Rolene. All right, ladies, without much further ado, how and why do we find ourselves here? And for those of you who know me, you'll know that I'm not always politically correct, and I would assume that this is a space where I can be diplomatic, but then also be very forthcoming as well. We find ourselves in this movement, or in this season, where particularly Jewish people and those within the Black community, frankly, I'm one of them, at times find ourselves conflicted to say, okay, here's an issue, here are people who are crying for justice and who are saying that we are experiencing particular challenges within our community. But at the same time, it seems as if the organizations that are leading the charge with regards to helping Black people have got these anti-Semitic statements in their founding documents. There are chants when we go to these various rallies that are anti-Semitic. So where should our alliances be, and should we be involved in any way? As Rolene said, it's important for us to understand the context within which this is happening, and more importantly, why, in my opinion, and also an opinion that's shared by many, this has started to happen. If you'll allow me to look a little bit, before I speak to apartheid South Africa, just a little bit at the history here, very broadly here within the United States. Now, across the world, the Black struggle has always been powerful. You look at apartheid. you look at slavery, you look at Jim Crow here in the United States. I say that the Black struggle has always been very powerful because as soon as you start to mention these challenges and mention these struggles, people all around the world want to rally, want to ensure that the injustices that we're experiencing don't repeat. I wonder why in these challenges with the Palestinian, we see continuous regarding the issue, regarding these narratives within the Palestinian conflict. And is it appropriate that matchup? My honest opinion with regards to why we're here is a lack. If we look in Africa, there's a lack of education in terms of who Israel is. Israel did. Oftentimes when I tell Africans that when African countries gained their independence from colonization in the early 1950s, 1960s, the country after the United States that had the most number of embassies on the African continent was this little country that had just herself become a democracy called Israel. Israel, ladies and gents, built Africa's roads. Israel built Africa's hospitals. And when I say Africa's hospitals, of course, I'm generalizing. But when you look at her presence in all of these 30 countries, it was very prominent. She was a great participant and help in establishing our security systems. But if you talk to Africans about that today, they've forgotten about it. So when they think of Israel and they think of Africa, they just think of, oh my gosh, apartheid, and Israel now being the new apartheid instead of South Africa. If you come over to the United States and you look at the Black community here in the United States, there's a lack of education and a lack of understanding as to the historical ties that existed between Israel and the Jewish community as well as Black Americans. You look at people such as Martin Luther King and that incredible march with Rabbi Abraham Josh Heschel. People have forgotten about that. They don't know about that. There's an organization that was started by Dr. King's right-hand man, Bayard Rustin, together with a gentleman called Philip Randolph, and it was called BASIC, the Black Americans to Support the Israel Committee. Now, not only was this organization a Black Zionist movement, but it was also a response to the anti-Israel sentiment that was rising at that time within the Black community. This particular organization, ladies, had 7 tenets. Let me say ladies and gents, had 7 tenets. And even though most, actually all of them are very profound, I think that there are 3 that are specifically relevant to our discussion today. The first one, because not only was it something that was important for the Americans then, but it also linked back to how many of us feel in South Africa and across the world, was one of the tenets was there had to be support for Israel's right to exist. Now, what's interesting about this particular tenet is that they didn't just say we are supporting Israel's right to exist. They noted that we are supporting Israel's democratic right to exist. So in this particular tenet, they also noted that there was this existence of political freedoms, religious freedoms, there were secure civil liberties, free and universal education, as well as advanced social welfare. So if there was an appreciation as to that as what Israel was then, has Israel changed with regards to who she is in terms of these particular freedoms, I ask? And we know that the question is no. But because of a lack of education, people don't know that. The second tenet was that they noted that oil prices had a disaster upon Blacks in America, and not just in America, but in Africa too. Ladies and gents, I just mentioned that at the independence received by former colonized African country, the #1 country that helped them with regards to much of what they're doing in terms of development was the nation of Israel. The question has to be asked as to why don't we see those ties, even though in many of these countries those ties are being reestablished? What happened that we now see the reestablishment of those ties? Because that implies that they were cut. The answer is because of the oil embargo that happened in the early 1970s. So we had the increase in the price of oil due to this particular embargo, but the changes and the impact of this fell disproportionately on the Black Americans. But BASIC was broad enough as well as gracious enough to understand that this did not only fall heavily on the shoulders of Black Americans, but on millions of Black Africans too. At the time in Africa, Africans were told and continue to have good relations with us as Arab leaders and the Arab nations, and so not be severely impacted by the increase in oil prices. You have to cut ties with Israel. But unfortunately, ladies and gents, if you look at history, what happened is not only did the Arabs not make good on the promises of better oil prices and economic assistance and all of these various things that they said, you know what, don't worry about Israel, we'll give it to you instead. Those promises never came to fruition. But then also Africa suffered together with America, but then also Black Americans, nation to that. So there was an appreciation to how Arab nations have actually not framed Black people in the United States as well as in Africa as they could have been. The third one, and also the important one, was of a genuine Palestinian self-determination. And I want to emphasize the word genuine. Many of us, I do believe, appreciation as to the fact that the Palestinian people across the world are like, okay, people are suffering. However, the notion that Israel is an apartheid state, and now with the increase with regards to these statements being made by Black Lives Matter, this continues to be a smokescreen to the real of the Palestinian people are. All the way back to basic saw the PLO as a terrorist group that used violent oppression against innocents, but also opinions. And if they saw the PLO then a terrorist group, you can rest assured that they would see the Palestinian Authority today as a terrorist group. In an op-ed that Rustin, one of the co-founders of BASIC, said, he actually said that if a Black community here in the United States support the PLO that existed, that they risked three things to the community. And as I read, you'll actually see how these three come to fruition here in the United States and have given fuel to the Black Lives Matter movement. They cause serious division within our own ranks, all right, supporting PLO within our own ranks, and that's what's happened to Black people. Risk their own moral prestige, and then becoming accomplices of an organization that is actually committed to the destruction of Israel, and so the Jewish people. And ladies and gents, as I was reading this, as a South African, I identified with this because in my own country, and those of you from South Africa know this, that there's division within our own ranks as saying, no, Israel is not a state, and I'll quickly delve into the definition of that because I think we remind ourselves of it. But then we also forfeit our own moral prestige. And I can say this as a Black person, when a Black person stands up and says, yes, Israel is an apartheid state, and you look and you're like, wait a minute. But if what you're saying that Black people suffer during apartheid is what is happening now in Israel, you're giving up your moral prestige, your moral authority, because you're lying, frankly. You're absolutely lying. And then also becoming accomplices of an organization to the bloody destruction of Israel. I've said this many times before, that if people were going to misappropriate my country's history and actually want to see the empowerment, actually want to see the liberation of the Palestinian people, you know, I can kind of forgive and say, okay, maybe there's a misunderstanding as to what apartheid was, but that's not what they want. If we look at how the Palestinian people continue to suffer, the people that are enjoying all of the benefits that come from using this narrative is the Palestinian leadership, because they continue to get the money that's there. And then they also continue to oppress their very own people, while the world, because of the smokescreen, continues to target as well as make accusations against Israel. And unfortunately, not only against Israel, but against the Jewish diaspora in a way that we've now seen with the increase in anti-Semitism that has been going on across the world. So part of the turn that we've seen in support for Israel and the Jewish diaspora, both in South Africa and Africa, as well as here in the United States, is because of the courting, in my opinion, by pro-Palestinian organizations, pro-Palestinian initiatives that have courted Black people Marxist style and have said, you know what, here's a hand. We have been experiencing the same challenges as you have been. Absolutely. And what has enabled things, Israel has over the years told to the world that it is an apartheid state, or rather Israel has been told, but people have said this. So using the pain and what we went through, people the world have, every time they hear Israel, they're like, oh, that's an oppressive state. Oh, that's where inequalities happened. So instead of the Israel-Palestinian struggle having been what it was, which is an issue of governance, self-determination, an issue of land, who's going to have what and how much land, it's now morphed into justice, It's now morphed into an issue of racial inequality. It's now morphed into an issue of human rights, the oppressor versus the oppressed. It now seems that you can't talk justice with regards to any people if you don't somehow, in that conversation, make a statement that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is a colonialist empire, that Israel is an oppressor of those that are vulnerable. So the apartheid narrative is, in my opinion, something that has over the years, because it's been spewed on university campuses across the world, particularly here in the United States, the BDS, students advocating for justice and all these various other groups, Jewish Voice as well. And it's an artery to anti-Semitism that needs to be cut off. Let's remind ourselves as to what apartheid was. Apartheid was a systematic form of legislation, or legislation that over a period of from 1948 all the way till 1994, systematically was institutionalized by way of legislation. Over 150 pieces of legislation, ladies and gents, that said Black people, or rather non-white people, could not pretty much engage with white people only because of the color of their skin. The intention behind it was, Black people, you know what? You're human, but you're not really human. You haven't really developed to the state that white people have. And so in your best interest, as well as in the white people's best interest, we need to ensure that as society, we keep everybody apart. But we recognize that you are good for something, and what you are good for is to provide labor. And so where we place you to live, and so in the interactions that you will have with each other, and from time to time have with white people, it's all going to be because of labor. Labor reasons are what are going to bring you together. You can't participate in the main economy, you can't vote, you can't share the same public facilities. You need medical assistance, okay, you can have medical assistance, but it's not going to be of a quality that white people are going to have. You want to go to school? Oh, don't worry, we will have a school system for you. But by law, because Black people don't need to rise up and so need to be educated to become doctors and lawyers, because that's not what they're good for, we're going to ensure that you have an education system, but that education system, called the Bantu education system, is going to be catered to your ability to succeed in life. And so, ladies and gents, by law in South Africa, the education that Black people received was of a much inferior quality to what white people received, again, purely because of the color of their skin. I had a look at mine, and I'm going to start wrapping up. I had a look at my birth certificate a couple of years ago when I was putting my application in for a green card here in the United States, and I got this shock. And I remember calling my dad. I was like, Dad, have you seen this? And he was like, what? I was like, on my birth certificate. Ladies and gents, I was born in the city of Pretoria. And those of you that are familiar with South Africa, Pretoria is the capital of South Africa. However, I'm a Tswana, that is my tribe. In South Africa, for those of you that aren't South Africans, we have many tribes. Tswanas, Sutus, Bedis, Xhosa, we have a whole bunch of them. Now, during apartheid, during the time that I was born, there was this move to not only keep Black people segregated from white people, purely again because of the color of their skin, but there was also this move to ensure that Black people stayed in various areas within the country according to their tribe. So further separation and further segregation of people, again, purely because of the color of their skin. And even though I was born in the capital of South Africa, the citizenship that was ascribed to me on my birth certificate was not South African, but it was Bophuthatswana. And South Africans on the call will smile, or at least will be shocked as they smile, because they'll recall that Bophuthatswana was one of the homelands that was established by the apartheid government that said, you know what, yes, we see that there's this international pressure for Black people to have their own self-governance and their own self-determination. So we're going to create these homelands where you can go in yourselves. But ladies and gents, it was an absolute farce because there was no independence. We were still, and I say we, our leaders, still had to report to the main apartheid government. They still ruled and had to say what they said. So over a period of 10 years, a decade, within the apartheid years, over 9 million Black South Africans lost their citizenship, again, purely because of the color of their skin. And so when we look at Israel, I don't need to tell you, but when we look at Israel, Israel is far from being an apartheid state. But unfortunately, we've allowed the voices that continue to say Israel is an apartheid state and there's racial inequality and there's oppression. These voices have been heard, and in their hearing, a gap a void has been now created, that there's now been no education as to who Israel really is, how she's been an amazing help to not only Black Americans, but Black Africans. I look at the work that the Jewish community has done within South Africa, and my heart is grateful, because South Africa wouldn't be where she is if it was not for the contribution of the Jewish community. So let me say this. I, particularly as a Black person, as a Black South African, a Black African, and now somebody that's married to a Black American and raising a Black American son, I'm grateful for what the Jewish community has done. There is no, if I can be so blunt, difference between the BLM and the movement for BLM. So between Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives Matter, yes, there are very well-meaning people on the ground who want to show their association and who want to stand with the Black people. And we say, thank you for wanting to identify with our cause and wanting to see us in a better place. However, there are many ways within which the Black community here in the United States, as well as in Africa and South Africa, can be helped. There are communities that are, and projects that are there, that aren't wanting to see the destruction of Israel, that aren't calling for the attack on Jewish people wherever they may be. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Dan, and obviously I'll be very happy to take any questions and answers from everybody.
I'm going to jump in there. First of all, Olga has the cutest child you'll ever see in your life. He really is absolutely edible. But I'm going to put a question out to Dan. We've been speaking in the context of Black Lives Matter about how important social justice is, the working for equality. This is the kind of language that especially attracts younger people, the younger generation. And you've just given an indication of the difference between the movement and the slogan. However, when we do see the rise of these kind of movements, we've seen it not just with Black Lives Matter, but also with the Me Too movement and the Women's March movement. Anti-Israel groups like BDS are very, very quick to co-opt the narrative. And I'm going to ask Dan, I'm going to throw over to Dan now to explain how the, for want of a better word, the Israelophobes manage to infiltrate and to spread this kind of rhetoric that actually takes away from the message of justice, from equality, from human rights, and make it about something else and cause even more division.
Well, thank you very much, Rolene, for such a simple question to start out with. I think that the last time I was asked such a simple question was the third time I took the SATs. And I'd like to also say what an honor it is to be on any panel with Olga Washington. I would like to basically give her my 15 minutes and just help her to continue to clarify everything that the 50 people on this call, including myself, would like further clarification on. So God bless Olga, and it's really a pleasure to be with WIZO. Just as an introductory personal comment, as the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, I was honored to work with WIZO and Helena Glazer, and many of you on this call as well, just a few years ago when I served, or some years ago, actually 7 or 8 years ago when I served in that role. And I also consider myself an adopted son of South Africa in a certain sense, because when I was 15 years old, I was a very competitive tennis player. South Africa had one of the most advanced junior development tennis programs in the world. And I was part at that time of the Southern Transvaal. I was the only foreigner allowed to compete and train with what was then called Southern Transvaal Junior Squad. And I witnessed firsthand what apartheid South Africa was at that time. And that's why when I witnessed in the year 2000, when I fast forwarded from being a young teenage tennis player growing up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, at that time, I've been in Israel now for 30 years and raised 5 children and married to an Israeli Sephardi woman, a brown woman, if we're talking in terms of color. So I was so shocked to see, and this is addressing your question, Rolene, this is a transition comment I'm making here. I was so shocked to see in South Africa in the first week of September, just before the horrors of September 11, 2001, the week before were the horrors of Durban, South Africa, under the sanction of the United Nations, was the one and only Jewish majority state of Israel, being attacked by Yasser Arafat, Nasser al-Qidwa, his nephew, and the rest of the NGO forum in Durban as being a genocidal, apartheid, war criminal state. The only one in the international community, according to that human rights assembly in Durban, South Africa, at that time celebrating 6 years the end of the apartheid regime, and then in the post-apartheid new mourning for South Africa, the Rainbow Nation under the presidency of President Mandela, or perhaps his successor by that time. And I was so shocked to see that type of language, that type of discourse being used against Israel. That was the ideological root of the international global BDS warfare campaign to dismantle the nation state of the Jewish people by other means other than military or terrorist means. But as everybody on this call knows, the type of extremist rhetoric that has been used on the African continent between tribes and clans and families, one thinks of the Tutsis and the Hutus, and the type of mass murder that went on following the type of radical and extremist discourse. That type of discourse was used uniquely against the Jewish state, beginning in 2001 and until this very day. What we saw just a couple of months ago, Rolene, in terms of the Israelophobia that we've witnessed, is after this terrible case of police brutality that turned into actually second-degree murder against Mr. George Floyd of Minneapolis, Minnesota, who was in handcuffs and arrested by the Minneapolis Police Department, and then subsequently choked to death by a police officer there, that sparked the widest spread riots and violence and demonstrations that the United States has seen in its major cities since the 1960s, and the radicalization, what Olga referred to was originally the civil rights movement, which radicalized in the mid-1960s and turned into the Black Panther movement and Malcolm X, and a much more violent expression of the justified demand for civil rights and human rights for Black Americans. Now, Jews, what makes this discussion today, meaning BLM and the effect on diaspora Jewry, such an important discussion with far-reaching circumstances, is that Jews from South Africa to Australia to Latin America to Europe have always been part of the move for social justice and the move for race relations and the move for racial equality. And, you know, I remember, if you remember the famous story in 1965 in a place called Philadelphia, Mississippi, in which Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner from New York City were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan because they dared help Black Americans register to vote in the mid-1960s. This is a year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by President Johnson, and they were found murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Today, Israel, the Jewish state, is being held out as being a type of uniquely Ku Klux Klan state by not the far right, but by the far left in the United States. The Antifa movement and the leadership of the Black Lives Movement, not the protest slogan Black Lives Matter, because everybody on this phone call and Jews around the world have always believed that Black Lives Matter and the lives of every human being matters, but very much that Black Lives Matters, and Jews shed their blood, as Goodman and Schwerner did, around the world for the issue of racial equality and racial minorities. But what has happened, as Olga pointed to, and Rolene has asked in her question, has been a racialization, inverted in quotations, of the issue of the Jewish state. Meaning, if the anti-Israel movement that I mentioned in Durban, South Africa, was nominally about creating a Palestinian state next to Israel, now there has been a racialization of this territorial issue in which Israel is being recast as a type of Ku Klux Klan entity that cannot shed itself of that identity. In other words, from the point of view of leaders like Minister Farrakhan, of the Nation of Islam, or Mark Lamont Hill, a professor at Temple University, and the mainstreaming of this racialization of the Jewish state, the only way to solve the racialization of the Jewish state is to get rid of the Jewish state and rebuild it from the ground up. That is the radicalization, Rolene, of the discourse that we are seeing now in the streets of many US cities: Portland, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and other cities in the United States. And this is a dangerous development, because if the only way to for Israel to be recast in a more positive light is by definition to dismantle and destroy the Jewish state and rebuild it from the ground up as an expression of as Patrisse Cullors of Black Lives Matter, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, called a Black liberation, to realize Black liberation. In their view, that means destroying the United States from the ground up. That means dismantling local governments. That means defunding local police departments. That means completely rebuilding local civil society in the United States, and by extension in Europe. If you look at the Black Lives Matter political protest across Western Europe, and they're calling for that type of dismantling and rebuilding from the ground up. And if you look at the rhetoric on YouTube regarding Israel's, now listen to this, put your seatbelts on for this one. Israel is being held as complicit in the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Well, that was a shock to so many of us, because we said, well, what the devil does Israel have to do with the domestic issue of police brutality against African Americans in the United States? And sure enough, one of the BDS groups at the University of Southern California circulates a petition on social media that says, well, you know, law enforcement officers, men and women of law enforcement agencies across the United States have traveled to Israel in 2012, 13, and 14 to learn these, what they call the knee to neck techniques. Well, there were no such these techniques being traded by the Israeli police. It was all counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, and terrorism prevention in Israel. But we are witnessing a radicalization and a racialization of the discourse surrounding the Jewish state. And that has placed the Jewish community in the diaspora, in my view, in danger, because the anti-Semitic violence, which will boomerang against diaspora Jews, is rooted in this racialization discourse of the Jewish state.
I'm going to throw a question out to both of you. With the rise of this kind of discourse, it opens up a channel, or it creates an environment where we have infiltration, not just from the far left, as we're talking about now, BDS, these kind of organizations that want to see an end to the existence of the state of Israel by any means necessary. But it also creates a vacuum for the far right to come in. All this is taking place against the backdrop of a global pandemic, and with that comes economic turndown. And often on the front lines are Jews being attacked for this, or Jews being blamed for this. Dan, as you just said, we were blamed for the horrendous murder of George Floyd. So we've got a vacuum now for the far left to come in with these kind of radical marches, not just what we're seeing in America, but we've seen it in Paris, in London, in the streets of other countries around the world. But it also creates an opportunity for the far right. Any issue that is race focused is something that they see as an opportunity to race bait and to get into some kind of a war. And caught in the middle of all of this are our diaspora community. So I'm going to put the very, very trying and difficult questions out to both of you. Where to from here, especially for our diaspora communities? Do we start to work with organizations like Black Lives Matter? How do we work with allies? Who do we need to speak to? Where to from here? And after you've answered, I'm going to throw it out to our audience to ask their questions.
Clearly, I think if I might just jump in and finish the second 2 minutes, there's some good news here in everything that's going on, and that is what has happened in the last 48 hours with the normalization calls and the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel is a revolutionary development in the last century of the Middle East. You know, when WIZO was founded in July of 1920, Mrs. Rebecca Seif had this vision of justice for Jews and also others in the Holy Land, but to create the legitimacy of Jewish education and Jewish social services based on, of course, the Balfour Declaration, and then the international community's call for the Jewish people to reconstitute, that was their language, reconstitute the Jewish national home in Palestine. Now, what has happened now with the UAE is that the UAE recognition of Israel, the way Mrs. Seif saw it in 1920 and the San Remo Conference saw it in 1920, just 3 months before the WIZO's founding in London, is the fact that they are recognizing Israel without calling for this draconian and radical concession from Israel, which is what the Arab world has called very much for the last 30 years, not to mention that they hadn't even recognized Israel. Remember the 3 no's of Khartoum, Sudan? Well, just several years ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Sudan, gaining private recognition, and now the public recognition and normalization of the United Arab Emirates is a destruction of the very discourse that I spent the first 7 or 8 minutes discussing on this call. In other words, we have seen a complete reversal of fortunes. The Palestinian propagandistic narrative that Olga Meshoe Washington talked about, that Israel is an apartheid state, a genocidal war criminal, has now been destroyed by the very fact of the UAE recognition of Israel as it is today. The fact that people are saying that Israel gave up the notion of applying Israeli law in parts of Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, is, in my view, a non-starter. The fact is that one of the major Gulf states has recognized the Jewish state's right as a civilization to live in the Middle East together with Muslim civilization, and that is why, friends, this is called the Abrahamic Agreement. That's the name of the agreement, because it basically accepts Muslim civilization through the Arab world and Jewish civilization through the Jewish state of Israel to live together in the historic Middle East. This is a destruction of the Palestinian, the PLO narrative, which denies Israel any sovereign right to live as a Jewish state in the Middle East. So now, what do we do? Just to go to Rolene, then I'm going to turn over to Olga. You know, Olga and I and a number of others, and Rolene, are working together to create a new coalition of Black Americans and Africans and Israelis in order to rebuild that historic alliance, that solidarity that Reverend Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and Bayard Rustin stood for. The American Black Zionist Alliance we are rebuilding it, and we are going to create a counter narrative through IPSI, which is the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, which Olga and her husband Joshua are executives of, together with us in the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We wanted to work with WIZO, and so we are creating that counter coalition in order to counter the radicalized discourse in the United States and in Europe. And now with the UAE legitimization of the Jewish state's position as a civilization country in the Middle East, it's entirely possible. So this is very important news and something that we can use as a basis to work from and to work towards, Rolene.
Olga.
Yeah, thank you, Rolene. Dan said a lot, and he's 100% correct. I agree with regards to this incredible thing that's happened with regards to the normalization of Israel's relationship with the UAE. There's still a lot of work that has to be done with young people in terms of they see this particular political governance, diplomatic action having taken place. But in terms of reversing the ideology that has infiltrated, unfortunately, many of the schools, as well as pop culture, we've seen over the last couple of weeks many prominent Black Americans making anti-Semitic statements, is what Dan is alluding to. This particular coalition, one of its core functions is going to be education. Both he and I have spent some time going back into history and explaining why certain things have happened. Many of these youngsters, many people within both the Black community and frankly, I would say some within the Jewish community, have no recollection, no understanding of either the relationships that existed that had us as Black people actually being very strong allies, that were not just willing to be allies behind the scenes, but were vocal and were public with regards to calling out anti-Semitism. You ask yourselves now, where are these major Black voices? Be they politicians, be they people from pop culture, be they people from certain other industries, where are their voices now? We hear one or two or three of them, but not at the levels that we should be hearing. So the education, the re-education that needs to happen, and understanding as to what are these terms. Is this true? Is Israel an apartheid state? What is the radicalization that has happened? Who exactly is Hamas? Who exactly is the PLO? What is the history? That has to happen so that a conviction starts to form with regards to this is who Israel is, this is who the Jewish people are. And so why we will not only stand with them, but be vocal in our advocacy. I say this very respectfully. Over the last couple of years, and it's been wonderful, many people have had the opportunity to travel to Israel, to see Israel with their own eyes. But when the heat is on, there isn't an understanding of what needs to be done and how that should be done. So I'm very excited with regards to this coalition that Dan's alluding to, because people that are going to be coming through the program and that we're going to be working with, not only are they going to receive the information, but also the tools with regards to how they can speak up and ensure that there's this change, this reshifting with regards to this ideology that's been happening. And then practically, Rolene, if I can say, and I'm also reflecting on my experiences in South Africa, and when I say more so my experiences in South Africa, because I did a lot more community work in South Africa with the Jewish community, I always said that the Jewish community needs to continue to encourage their youngsters to be proud to be Jews, to understand who they are as Jews, to understand who they are as Zionists. It is very difficult for a non-Jew to come into a situation, to come into a room, and we're talking Israel, 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 and then you have young Jewish kids going, nah. And we're like, huh? So once again, the embracing of the fact that how important Zionism is and how important Zion is, and no embarrassment with regards to who Israel is, what Israel is, a reminder of Israel's contribution as a light to the nations in Africa, as a light to the nations in various countries across the world, because also what that does is that it makes Israel and the conversation of Israel personal. Rolene, you spoke about the economic downturn. I've had young people in South Africa come to me and be like, okay, but why must I support Israel when it's a country that's so far away, when I'm hungry? And we can say to them, okay, this is why you can support Israel. Do you know that Israel's technology allows us to do X, Y, and Z, which ensures that then you're not going to be hungry. So there's then this personal connection that happens where they have this historical understanding of who Israel is and who Israel can continue to be as a friend. And we found that to be very, very powerful.
Olga, I'm just, what happened to the Z, my friend? What happened to the Z?
What's Z?
The Z. We went from Z to Z.
I'm sorry, no. Although, please allow me. I am very proud. My husband says that I'm arrogant about it, but I dismiss that. I still say water. And when we go to a restaurant and they have no idea what I'm saying, I will spell it. I will say, please can I have a W-A-T-E-R. I will not say the other one.
No, Olga, just now you and I are going to have a chat. well, fine. Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. If anybody wants to put them on the chat. But I reiterate what Dan and Olga have said, this act of normalizing the United Arab Emirates. We really cannot underscore the importance of this, what it will mean for cooperation in so many different fields, economically, medically now, which is something we have been doing, a sharing of cultures. This is how we make peace possible. We build it from the ground up, from the people up, and it's something that I see as a game changer, especially when we have the president of a neighboring country that we regard as an enemy, that being Lebanon, saying that he's open to discussing the policy or the potential for peace. So if anybody has questions for our two phenomenal dynamic guests, let's go for it. If you can put your hand up, or you can type it in the chat here. I'm obviously going to need Martin or let's help with the technology, because I am a little bit of technology channel, but we're very, very happy to take your questions.
I think Michaela has a question. She just needs to be unmuted or unmute herself.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you, Dan and Olga, or Olga, like we pronounce it in Holland. 4 years ago, I was in New York, and I was walking in Harlem, and I got into a discussion with Black people who they believe that they are Jewish. I'm sure that you are aware of them, right? And I had a whole discussion, and then I told them, well, I said, well, I think it's great. I mean, everybody should be welcome. And then they told me, basically, you are not Jewish. And I looked at them, what do you mean? I'm not Jewish. My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish. No, according to us, you are not Jewish. So even within our own community, we practice these kind of things, but do we try to, or is it in the States, is they're trying to make any connections with them, or are they still in the same, how would I say,
I think I know what you're opting to, what you're referring to, is that we have seen, especially on social media, places like Twitter, the
that
narrative
they're going against the whole, well, or more like integrating, mixing. You understand what I mean, Rolene?
I understand where you're going, because we're seeing it a lot on Twitter, is the accusations. We've heard it from Farrakhan. We heard it before his teshuvah, or his apology, Nick Cannon, speaking about the fact that Jews aren't the original Hebrews. That allegation. If Olga or Dan, you want to address it?
Well, Olga's father-in-law, Reverend Pastor Du Masani Washington, is one of the leading authorities on the Black Hebrew, Black Israelite movement. So I know that Olga's also a real authority, and her husband Joshua. So Olga, perhaps can you create some context here about what's really going on? Because I heard Michaya say they're part of our community, but these are not Jewish people. You want to? Can you help us understand, Olga?
Sure. So you are 100% correct that my father-in-law is more of an authority on this than I am. But in summary, what this is about is that you have got a group of people, Black people, predominantly Black Americans, who have taken scripture, the Bible, Torah. They've taken Torah, the scripture. Okay. They've taken scripture and they have plucked out selectively scripture pertaining to who the Hebrews were, where they came from, their legacy. And they have then assigned it and then deduced it to the fact that only Black people can be Jews. You don't have to have Jewish heritage, but only Black people. So it's disinformation, or rather misinformation, with regards to what the Bible says, what Torah says. And then also when you have the likes of Louis Farrakhan, who has gained prominence as this religious leader, as this figure, because people are looking for answers. Remember, a lot of people are struggling with regards to identity. They're struggling with regards to feeling part of a family, fitting in. There's many challenges that communities all over the world have, including the Black community. And so in belonging, they have found this loophole to say, this is where we belong. And they take scripture, like I say, and they twist it. So they are not Jews, like Dan says, at all. It'll be somebody like me who, if you track my ancestry, I have no DNA that shows me belonging to any to any Jewish tribe at all, but purely because of the color of my skin. Again, this whole racialization, because of the color of my skin, I am part of God's chosen people. I am the one that is a special race. It is only me.
I have a question from WIZO Australia, or a request to ask a question from WIZO Australia. So let's just find.
I'm
Is
actually
everyone
here
can mute
twice.
yourself?
It's me, Rolene, Paulette. Firstly, thank you very much for organising this. And it's great to hear Dan as well as Olga. But I have a question I'd like to address to you, Olga, particularly. At the end of your initial speech to us, you said that we need to support BLM in all its forms in Africa and in America. I believe that we should support BLM, but I'm conflicted because we know that there is a lot of BDS within the BLM organisation. We've had that come here in Australia. We've had our Aboriginals here march, and they have every right to, because they have been treated very, very badly over the years. But based on all of this, and I don't think Australia's unique, anti-Semitism is rising at a rapid rate. And in a country like Australia, where we're actually isolated from a lot of the rest of the world, it's very frightening when we see kids in our state schools being beaten up, being made to kiss the feet of Muslim children. And all of this is an addition to the Black Lives Matter, the anti-Semitism that comes out of it, the fact that a lot of Black Lives Matter supports BDS. I'm very confused, and my heart tells me I need to support it, but my Jewishness tell me, how can you put something against everyone? Thank you.
I appreciate that. Just to clarify, I did not say that everybody should support it in all of its forms. If I could preface it before I respond directly to your answer, that, you know, do people need to do research, need to look at their homework and then come to a conclusion that is comfortable for them. However, if I were to be asked, should we support Black Lives Matter because we want to support the cause of Black people, because we want to see their lives bettered? Should we support the movement for Black Lives Matter? My simple answer is no. And my answer is no, because you'll be supporting, and so giving credence to, giving credibility to an organization that once you've supported them, and I'll come to their support or lack of support for the Black community, that once you've supported them, they turn around and say, we don't want you. My husband, Joshua Washington, he's a blogger for the Times of Israel, and he more recently wrote an incredible blog. I think he released it about a week ago, that breaks down in a very simple way what the movement for Black Lives Matter says with regards to the Jews and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and what the movement for Black Lives Matter says. And he makes a very interesting case to say that there is no other group on this planet, including Black people ourselves, that would be required to join a movement that is directly calling for their destruction. So a couple of weeks ago, we saw in Durham here in North Carolina, where as Black Lives Matter, one of the things that they seek to address, they tell us, is the police brutality. So in wanting to address this, they want to defund the police. But then here you have people that are calling and saying, let's defund the police, but at the very same time are saying death to Israel and calling Israel all sorts of names. Now, should we support Black lives? Absolutely, please do. Should you support Hispanic lives? Please do. Should you support Aboriginal lives? Absolutely, 100%. There are many, many, many avenues, many organizations that are doing incredible work for minorities, incredible work for the Jewish community. I'm very happy to send Rolene a list of organizations if there are people that generally want to provide assistance to Black communities here in the United States. Unfortunately, it seems to have become a statement to say that the only way to support Black lives in the United States is by supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's incorrect. Like I say, there's many organizations, many people that are genuinely seeking the betterment of Black people. There are Black people themselves that are disputing whether the Black Lives Matter organization is actually good for the Black community. When you see how Black homes, Black businesses have been destroyed, when you look even at their manifesto, their statement with regards to what it speaks to, with regards to the core family of the Black family, or the coreness of the Black family, people are saying, okay, but is that actually what we want as a people? So people, you know, like, do your own homework and research, but no, ma'am, I'm saying there are many other places to support Black people.
Just for anybody who's on our WIZO WhatsApp group, the article that Olga's talking about is up already. We're that quick.
Very
Are there any other questions before I hand over, or let Dan speak before we hand over to Martine? Dan?
I just wanted to make a discrete point that didn't come up in our discussion today, and that is, it is become increasingly challenging, I think, for Jewish communities in the diaspora to come to grips with what has become collective anti-Semitism against the Jewish collective, meaning the state of Israel. Many people, what has happened in recent years is that this false notion of what's called legitimate criticism of Israel, and there is such a thing as legitimate criticism of Israel, but the way that when people in a bald-faced way start throwing adjectives out against Israel, such as Nazi, apartheid, fascist, genocidal, war criminal, imperialistic, colonialistic, those are not criticisms. That's anti-Semitism. It's rank anti-Semitism, because Israel is the only country in the world, in the 193-member community of the United Nations, in which that kind of language and those type of accusations are launched. And I think it's very important for us to understand that this is the new incarnation of anti-Semitism. It's collective anti-Semitism. Professor Bernard Lewis called it political anti-Semitism, but it is the same anti-Semitism that Natan Sharansky faced when he sat in jail for 7 years in Siberia, because he wanted and he loved the Jewish state and he wanted to immigrate to the Jewish state. And Sharansky, in a book that Olga and I worked on, called Israelophobia and the West, a hijacking of civil discourse and how to rescue it, which you can get for free online. If you go to jcpa.org, you can download this compendium, and it will explain what the difference between criticism of Israel and this wholesale anti-Semitism, Jew hatred against Israel is. I think that those distinctions are very important to make, because currently we're seeing the masking of anti-Semitism being expressed in this false notion of, well, I'm only criticizing Israel, I'm not an anti-Semite.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to these absolute giants of the Jewish world, of the world of civil rights and social justice, the phenomenal Olga Meshoe. Olga Meshoe, Washington. I'm so happy, so thrilled, and so proud to have had you participate today. It's been long overdue, and from the bottom of my heart, for all the work that you do for Israel, for the Jewish people, for all of us, thank you so much. And Dan, you know that you are not just an honorary South African, you're an honorary WIZO, a man of WIZO. If you were at our More a couple of years ago, Dan spoke there to tremendous response. I'm actually going to put the link for those who are on the WIZO WhatsApp to Dan's book. Dan, you are just a phenomenon, not just to be friends with, but also to work with. It is my honor and pleasure to learn from you and to work with you on the occasions that I am able to. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to and thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy days and busy evenings and your lockdowns and your babysitting to come and participate today. It is being recorded. It will be handed out if you request it. And I'm going to hand over to our lovely new chairperson of WIZO Modiin English speakers, the fabulous Martine Alperstein, to close us out.
Thank you. A huge thank you to our panel, Dan, Olga, and Rolene. And thank you to all the participants from all over the world. And I hope that you will all join us next week for our second talk in our Zoom series with Lieutenant Colonel Eyal Dror, who will be talking to us about Operation Good Neighbor, where Israel helped the Syrians with medical and other aid. We will be posting the information shortly in all our groups.
Thank you, everybody. And wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And thank you so, so much. And thank you to Galit for being my sanity and for being our technical support.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.